I think if you look from a grand strategic perspective, the worry here is that is this actually a war that's winnable from a Ukraine perspective, and is it losable from a Russian perspective, given that Putin only wanted a special military operation? If you explore those questions, the danger is you come to the conclusion that this is possibly and not a winnable war for Ukraine. Ukraine will probably never liberate Crimea and the Donbass, and therefore it's more a question of where the line gets drawn on a map as to when the war stops. And the West has got lots of its domestic priorities. Here in London, we have there's a cost of living crisis, there's an inflation crisis. We don't have the weapons in our inventory. We're doing the best we can to support Ukraine, but we can't keep going like that.
According to Russian media Military Affairs, the situation for Ukrainian troops in Kupyansk is becoming increasingly dire as Russian forces continue to advance and encircle the city from both flanks. According to the Ukrainian Telegram channel Resident, citing sources within the General Staff, there is no longer any realistic belief among the military leadership the city can be held. The Ukrainian army is also facing mounting pressure in Liman and Siversk, where Russian units are preparing to encircle the defending garrisons. According to Russian sources, Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrskyi reportedly lacks sufficient reserves to stabilize the front near Kupyansk, as most combat-ready forces have been redeployed to Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, discontent is reportedly growing among Ukrainian field commanders over heavy losses sustained near Pokrovsk.
Ебать, тут, сука, пидорасы уже! Налево!
Which is now itself close to being surrounded. Officers are said to refer to the ongoing battles there as another meat grinder. Despite this, Syrskyi continues to reject any discussion of a potential withdrawal, insisting that positions must be held at all costs. The report also notes that fighters from the Azov regiment were recently sent to reinforce the defense of Pokrovsk. However, aware that the operation was likely doomed, they refused to enter the city itself and are operating only on its outskirts. Now, as at the 7th of October, reports indicated that Russian assault units had secured positions in the center of Kupyansk and were advancing further along the city's southern edge. According to the Telegram channel Edi Samoti, the pace of Russian advances has recently increased, now exceeding 1 kilometer per day. Reports indicate that fierce fighting is taking place along the flanks of the Ukrainian grouping. Ukrainian forces are gradually retreating in an attempt to avoid encirclement. Analysts note that if Russian troops maintain their current momentum, the liberation of Kupyansk could occur in the near future. Military sources also report that on the Kupyansk front, Russian forces are advancing north of Stepove to Voselka, working to eliminate a large pocket southeast of the city. Heavy fighting continues in Kupyansk's central districts. The artillerymen of the 15th Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, Karadag, are among the units trying to stop the Russian advance towards Kupyansk. The soldiers have at their disposal a Slovak artillery installation, Zuzana II, well hidden with camouflage in a wooded area. The sky above the position is guarded by an armed detachment. In quotations, we get up early and go to bed early because the day is short, says the commander with the call sign Sailor. The 155mm gun uses fragmentation shells. They can hit manpower with a radius of 50 to 100 meters. This is how we stop the enemy's offensive and help our infantry. We are also in the infantry and we know what it is like when artillery covers you, says the Ukrainian military. The brigade is defending the front line north of Kupyansk in the village of Kandrashivka, already occupied by the Russians. The Russian army is trying to recruit infantry for an attack on the city, says the deputy commander of the unit with the call sign Major. That is why Ukrainian artillery is attacking the approaches to Kupyansk to prevent Russian units from reaching the city. Ukrainian sources report that Russians are using the following tactic. First, they send a large number of FPV drones. Then they also put into operation those with an optical link for control. Another military man with the call sign Trafka tells Dutch media outlet DW. His team is currently trying to stop the Russian infantry, which, according to the commander's observations, has become significantly more numerous in the Kupyansk area. In addition, his unit destroyed the crossing of the Oskil River, which divides Kupyansk, so that Russian units could not transfer equipment from the left to the right bank. The river is a natural obstacle for the Russians advancing towards Kupyansk. Alexander Bukata, commander of the 15th Brigade Karadag, told DW that the Russians are crossing the river in rubber boats. In order not to row with oars, they use ropes stretched between the two banks, with which they pull the boats, he explained. Small groups of Russians are also moving overland to the villages, where the units are regrouping and preparing for an attack. Bukata points to two factors that favor the Russian offensive in this section of the front. One is the long front line and the shortage of personnel among the Ukrainians. However, the commander does not believe that the Russians will be able to take Kupyansk completely. Kupyansk is important for the defense not only for Kharkiv region, but also for the Donetsk region, Bukata adds. In quotations, if Kupyansk falls, the front will shift to Borova. This is a problem because after Borova comes the Donetsk direction. That is, the front line will be extended, which the Ukrainians will have to defend with the same personnel. Now on the Pokrovsk front, Russian media South Front Press reported today that units of the center grouping are engaged in intense fighting for the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration, operating within the city and on its flanks. On the western axis, Russian forces have pushed Ukrainian forces back from tree lines between the Kotliny Highway and the railway. The clearing of Ukrainian strongpoints immediately beyond the city limits is underway. Russian units have established a presence between the strongpoints and the so-called Western Industrial Zone. They have entered the area of the pool warehouses and cut off Schmid Street. The advance poses a direct threat to Ukrainian logistics routes. Within Pokrovsk itself, fighting is ongoing in several areas. Clearing operations are ongoing in Yuzhny, Chatorsky, and Solnechny micro-districts, with fighting taking place around the vehicle depot and the water canal in the southeastern part of the city. In the city center, there are fierce clashes near the auto market, bus station, central market, and palace of pioneers. In the west, clearance operations are ongoing in the Durnyak area. On the northeastern flank, assault units advanced south of Rodinsky. After dislodging Ukrainian forces from the surrounding farmland, they cut off the northern Ukrainian logistics route, that is, the T0515 road from Novopilya. The northern route from Hershin is also under fire. Recognizing the threat, the Ukrainian command is attempting to hold the crossroads and is counterattacking. As a result of the summer campaign, Russian units advanced in several directions of the front, but could not overcome the positional impasse. Despite the tactical successes and expansion of the control zone, there was no deep breakthrough of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. The front remains relatively stable, and the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, still refuses to negotiate. In fact, the conflict has moved into the format of a war of attrition, where the outcome is not determined by kilometers of advance, but by the ability of the parties to conserve resources, produce weapons, and control the political situation. Sergey Polataev, a military expert, co-founder of the What For project, told Russian media Lenta about the strategy of the Ukrainian command in these conditions, how the winter campaign threatens the armed forces of Ukraine, and under what conditions the negotiations will give results. In quotations, I don't think the Russian offensive has reached a dead end. We are witnessing a war of attrition which has acquired a positional character. Fighting in this format has been going on since the summer of 2022. The main reason is the crisis of offensive means, he said. With the advent of drones capable of destroying heavy equipment, the use of classic breakthrough means, such as tank groups, has become almost impossible. The situation on the front line resembles the First World War. Then, large caliber artillery made the offensive suicidal by large forces. The losses in an hour could be estimated in the thousands. The front line stood still until the tanks appeared. Now drones play the same role. Last year, Russian troops achieved great results in Donbass because the best Ukrainian brigades were transferred to the Kursk region. Now they are scattered, have moved to a deft defense along the entire front line, and are not trying to attack. The plans of the Russian command for the end of the year are unknown, with the exception of 2 or 3 directions. This is now a relative calm at the front. It is difficult to say whether all the tasks of the summer campaign were completed. Contrary to mainstream Ukrainian and Western propaganda, these tasks were not publicly designated, Polataev says. But the summer campaign apparently ended by the beginning of October. Both sides used the pause to prepare for the next stage. The Russian command has obviously not yet achieved strategic goals from the collapse of the Ukrainian front. Russian forces have not yet managed to take Pokrovsk, but this did not force them to abandon the main task, that is, to exhaust the armed forces of Ukraine in positional battles. The crisis of reserves is growing on the Ukrainian side, threatening the collapse of defense. However, Ukraine is still not ready to start negotiations seriously. Ukraine fears the consequences of the negotiations will be more severe than the current situation. That is why the conflict is dragging on. Ukraine no longer hopes for a repeat of the success of 2022 in the Kharkiv region. The main calculation is the exhaustion of Russian units, destabilization within Russia, and a severe economic crisis. The country's authorities believe that a long-term confrontation can undermine Russia's resources and force it to make concessions. Ukraine has practically no other tools left except for the pressure on the Russian endurance. The armed forces of Ukraine apparently are no longer capable of conducting major offensive operations, Polataev notes. Therefore, Ukraine and its allies are trying to influence Russia in other ways. That is, strikes on oil refineries, sabotage in the rear, expansion of sanctions, cyber attacks, and gradual depletion of the economy. Ukraine alone will not be able to achieve this, but in conjunction with Western countries, it expects that the effect will accumulate. The Ukrainian calculation is simple. A long war should lead to a fall in production, a lack of funds, and a crisis in financing the Russian army.
Coming, mate, coming.